The sun was setting over the city, casting long shadows across the streets. Cars honked impatiently as traffic crawled along the main road, and people hurried home after another long day of work. It was just another evening in a busy urban area, but for Officer David Ryan, it would become an unforgettable night. David was sitting in his police cruiser parked near the corner of Maple Street. His eyes scanned the neighborhood lazily, though he wasn't paying much attention to anything specific. He had been on the job for nearly 20 years, and most days felt like a routine grind. Tonight was no different, or so he thought. Maple Street was part of an upscale neighborhood, filled with large houses surrounded by well-manicured lawns. The residents here were mostly wealthy professionals, doctors, lawyers, executives, and other influential figures. One of those residents happened to be Michael Carter, the director of the FBI. A man known not only for his sharp mind but also for his strong stance on equality and justice. Few people knew that Michael lived here. He preferred to keep a low profile despite his high-profile career. As David sat there, sipping coffee from a paper cup, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. Across the street, 4 teenagers were standing near a lamppost. They weren't doing anything suspicious, just talking and laughing, but their presence caught David's attention immediately. Probably up to no good, David muttered under his breath. He rolled down his window slightly, squinting at them through narrowed eyes. To him, they looked like troublemakers. Their clothes were casual, and 2 of them wore hoodies pulled over their heads. It didn't matter that they weren't breaking any laws or causing disturbances. All David saw was what he expected to see: young black kids hanging around where they didn't belong. Without thinking twice, David turned on the flashing lights of his cruiser and pulled up closer to the group. As he stepped out of the car, his boots echoed loudly against the pavement. The teenagers stopped talking and turned to look at him, their expressions shifting from surprise to unease. "What are you boys doing here?" David asked gruffly, his tone dripping with accusation. He crossed his arms over his chest, towering over them with his uniform and badge gleaming under the streetlights. One of the teens, a tall boy named Marcus, spoke up nervously. "We're just hanging out, sir. We're not bothering anyone." "Hanging out?" David repeated, raising an eyebrow. "This isn't your neighborhood. You shouldn't be loitering around here." Marcus exchanged glances with his friends, unsure how to respond. None of them had done anything wrong, but they could sense the hostility in David's voice. Another teen, a shorter girl named Jasmine, tried to explain. "We live a few blocks away. We come here sometimes because it's quiet." David scoffed. "Quiet? That doesn't mean you can just wander into someone else's property." His words came out harsher than necessary, fueled by assumptions he didn't even realize he was making. Jasmine took a step back, her hands raised slightly in defense. "And we're not on private property, we're on the sidewalk." But David wasn't listening anymore. His focus shifted briefly to the sleek black sedan parked nearby. It belonged to Michael Carter, though David didn't know that yet. All he cared about was teaching these kids a lesson. He wanted to show them who was in charge. With a huff, David walked back to his cruiser, ignoring the protests from the teenagers. Instead of parking properly, he backed up recklessly, aiming to position himself between the teens and the sedan. But in his haste, he misjudged the distance. There was a loud screech of metal against metal as the side mirror of his cruiser scraped along the passenger door of the sedan, leaving deep scratches across its glossy surface. For a moment, everyone froze. The sound seemed to echo endlessly in the quiet neighborhood. David stared at the damage, his face flushing red with embarrassment and anger. The teenagers gasped, pointing at the car. "You scratched it," Marcus exclaimed, his voice rising, in disbelief. "That's not ours." David spun around, glaring at them. "Don't act like this is your business," he snapped. "Stay out of it." Jasmine shook her head, stepping forward cautiously. "That's not fair. You damaged someone's car and we didn't do anything wrong." Her words hit a nerve. David's temper flared and he pointed a finger at her. "I said stay out of it. If I hear one more word from you, I'll arrest all of you for trespassing." The threat hung heavy in the air. The teenagers exchanged worried looks, but remained silent. They knew better than to argue further. Reluctantly, they began walking away. casting nervous glances over their shoulders as they left. Once they were gone, David leaned against his cruiser, trying to calm himself down. He glanced at the damaged sedan again, feeling a mix of frustration and dread. Whoever owned this car wouldn't be happy when they saw what had happened. Still, he convinced himself it wasn't entirely his fault. After all, if those kids hadn't been there distracting him, none of this would have occurred. Unbeknownst to David, everything had been captured on camera. Michael Carter's house was equipped with state-of-the-art security systems, including cameras mounted above the garage. Every second of the encounter, David's aggressive behavior, the collision, and the heated exchange afterward, had been recorded in crystal-clear detail. Later that evening, Michael returned home from a long day at the office. He parked his car in the driveway and noticed the scratches immediately. Frowning, he inspected the damage closely, wondering how it could have happened. Then he went inside and checked the security footage. As the video played back, Michael's expression darkened. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. A police officer acting recklessly and prejudicially had damaged his property while targeting innocent teenagers. Worse still, the officer's comments revealed blatant bias. Michael sighed deeply, rubbing his temples. He knew this wasn't just about his car. This was about accountability, integrity, and the kind of example he needed to set as the head of the FBI. Without hesitation, he picked up his phone and dialed the number for internal affairs. "This needs to stop," Michael said firmly when the call connected. "And it starts tonight." By morning, news of the incident had spread throughout the department. Officers whispered about it during roll call, and supervisors scrambled to contain the fallout. For David Ryan, however, the real consequences were only beginning. Little did he know, his actions would lead to far more than just a reprimand. They would change the course of his life forever. The next morning, the precinct was buzzing with whispers. Officers huddled in small groups, exchanging nervous glances and murmuring about what had happened the night before. David Ryan sat at his desk, pretending to focus on paperwork, but he could feel the weight of curious stares pressing down on him. He tried to act like nothing was wrong, but deep inside he knew this wasn't going to blow over easily. Agent Laura Monroe arrived early that day. She was a sharp investigator known for her attention to detail and fairness. Her reputation made her both respected and feared within the department. When she walked into the station, carrying a folder filled with evidence, everyone fell silent. Even David looked up briefly, though he quickly returned to shuffling papers, avoiding eye contact. Laura didn't waste time. She requested an immediate meeting with Captain Harris, the head of internal affairs. In his office, she laid out everything she had gathered so far: the security footage from Michael Carter's house, witness statements from the teenagers, and even photos of the damaged sedan. The video showed every detail clearly: David's aggressive tone, his reckless driving, and the derogatory remarks he made during the altercation. "This is serious," Laura said firmly, sliding the folder across the desk. "We're not just dealing with property damage here. This is misconduct motivated by bias." Captain Harris sighed, rubbing his temples. He had worked with David for years and knew the officer's reputation for being difficult. But this was beyond anything he'd expected. "What do you suggest we do?" he asked, already dreading the answer. "We need to investigate thoroughly," Laura replied without hesitation. "And if the evidence holds up, we'll have no choice but to take disciplinary action." Word spread quickly about the investigation. By lunchtime, nearly everyone in the department knew that David was in trouble. Some officers felt sympathy for him, believing he was being unfairly targeted because of who owned the damaged car. Others, however, weren't surprised. They'd seen David's behavior before, his quick temper, his dismissive attitude toward minority communities, but they'd stayed quiet, afraid of rocking the boat. David, meanwhile, refused to believe things were as bad as they seemed. He convinced himself that it was all a misunderstanding, that the teenagers had exaggerated the story to get back at him. "They're just kids," he muttered to his partner, Officer Greg Mitchell, during their break. "They don't know what they're talking about." Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He'd worked alongside David for years and had witnessed plenty of incidents where David let his biases cloud his judgment. But now, facing the possibility of consequences, Greg found himself torn between loyalty and doing the right thing. "I don't know, man," he said finally. "That video doesn't look good." David waved him off. "It's just politics. People always jump on stuff like this when it involves someone important. Trust me, I'll be fine." But as the days passed, the pressure mounted. Internal Affairs called in the 4 teenagers for formal interviews. Marcus, Jasmine, and their friends recounted the events calmly and honestly, sticking to the facts. They described how David had approached them aggressively, accused them of loitering without cause, and then damaged the car while trying to intimidate them. Their stories matched perfectly with the security footage, leaving little room for doubt. Laura also reached out to other officers who had worked with David over the years. Slowly but surely, patterns began to emerge. Several colleagues admitted to witnessing similar incidents where David had treated minority individuals unfairly. One officer recalled a traffic stop where David had used racially charged language. Another remembered a domestic dispute call where David had dismissed the concerns of a black woman, assuming she was exaggerating. Each piece of evidence added weight to the case against David. Yet despite the mounting proof, he remained defiant. When Laura asked to speak with him, he agreed reluctantly, showing up late and wearing a scowl. "Officer Ryan," Laura began, keeping her voice calm but firm. "We need to discuss the events of last night. Can you tell me your side of the story?" David leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "There's not much to say. Those kids were hanging around where they didn't belong. I was just doing my job." Laura raised an eyebrow. "Your job? Scratching someone's car and threatening arrest for trespassing when they were standing on public property? It was an accident." David shot back, his face reddening. "And those kids were troublemakers. You can't trust them." Laura studied him carefully, noting the defensiveness in his tone. "The security footage tells a different story. So do the witnesses. Do you understand the seriousness of this situation?" David clenched his jaw, refusing to respond. He still believed he could talk his way out of it, just like he had done countless times before. But Laura wasn't swayed. She continued gathering evidence, determined to ensure justice was served. Outside the precinct, news of the incident leaked to the media. Reporters descended on the neighborhood, interviewing residents and digging for details. Headlines blared across local newspapers and TV stations. "Racist cop damages FBI director's car." Protesters soon joined the fray, gathering outside the police station with signs demanding accountability. Chants of "No justice, no peace" echoed through the streets, drawing attention from across the city. The protests put additional pressure on the department. Politicians weighed in, calling for transparency and swift action. Community leaders held press conferences, urging citizens to remain peaceful while pushing for systemic change. For many, David's actions were symbolic of larger issues within law enforcement, a reminder of the biases and inequalities that persisted despite efforts to address them. Back at the precinct, tensions ran high. Some officers resented the scrutiny, feeling like they were being judged based on one person's mistakes. Others recognized the need for reform, but worried about backlash. A few brave voices spoke up, acknowledging the problem and pledging to do better. Among them was Greg Mitchell, who decided to share his own experiences working with David. "I've seen it happen before," Greg told Laura during a private meeting. "He's got a short fuse, especially with certain groups. I should have said something sooner, but I didn't want to make waves." Laura nodded, writing down his statement. "Thank you for coming forward. It takes courage to admit when something's wrong." As the investigation progressed, David's lawyer advised him to issue a public apology. "It might help your case," the lawyer suggested during a tense phone call. "Show some remorse, take responsibility." "No way," David snapped. "I'm not apologizing for doing my job. Let them prove I did something wrong." His refusal only made matters worse. Public opinion turned sharply against him, with critics labeling him as unrepentant and arrogant. Social media exploded with outrage, hashtags trending nationwide. Even celebrities and activists joined the conversation, amplifying calls for accountability. Despite the growing storm, David clung to denial. He convinced himself that the system would protect him, just as it always had. But behind closed doors, cracks began to show. His wife, Karen, grew increasingly frustrated with the constant attention and criticism. Their teenage son, Jake, stopped speaking to him altogether, ashamed of the family name being dragged through the mud. One evening, after another long day of questioning and tension, David sat alone in his living room, staring blankly at the television. The news was playing, but he barely registered the words. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind. What if this wasn't just a temporary setback? What if his career and his life was truly over? But instead of confronting those thoughts, David pushed them aside. He lit a cigarette, took a drag, and muttered under his breath, "This isn't fair." Fair or not, the wheels of justice kept turning. With each passing day, the evidence against him grew stronger, painting a picture of a man whose biases had finally caught up with him. And though David couldn't see it yet, his actions had set off a chain reaction that would ripple far beyond his own life, forcing an entire community to confront uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and prejudice. For now, though, David remained trapped in his own defiance, unwilling, or perhaps unable, to face the reality of what he had done. The courtroom was packed on the day of David Ryan's trial. Reporters lined the walls, scribbling notes furiously as spectators filled the benches. Some had come to support justice and accountability. Others were there out of curiosity or anger. The air buzzed with tension, thick enough to cut with a knife. At the center of it all sat David, his face pale and drawn. He fidgeted with the edges of his tie, trying to appear calm, but his hands betrayed his nerves. Agent Laura Monroe took her place at the prosecution table, her posture straight and confident. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building a case that left no room for doubt. Beside her sat Michael Carter, the FBI director whose car had been damaged. Though Michael preferred to stay out of the spotlight, he knew this trial wasn't just about him. It was about setting an example for the future. On the defense side, David's lawyer, Mr. Peterson, flipped through papers, looking for any angle to weaken the prosecution's argument. He had warned David repeatedly to show remorse, but David refused, convinced that admitting fault would only make things worse. Now, as the trial began, Peterson braced himself for a tough fight. The judge entered the room, and everyone stood, respectfully. Once seated again, the proceedings started. Laura was the first to speak. In clear, measured tones, she laid out the facts of the case. She described how David had approached the teenagers aggressively, accused them without cause, and then recklessly damaged Michael's car. To drive her point home, she played the security footage from the night of the incident. The courtroom fell silent as the video played. It showed every detail: David's harsh words, his careless driving, and the shocked expressions of the teenagers. When it ended, you could hear a pin drop. Even David shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Laura then called Marcus, one of the teenagers, to testify. Nervous but determined, Marcus recounted what had happened that evening. "We weren't doing anything wrong," he said, his voice steady despite his fear. "Officer Ryan came up to us like we were criminals. Then he scratched the car while yelling at us." Next, Jasmine spoke. Her testimony matched Marcus's perfectly. She described how David had threatened arrest simply because they dared to question his behavior. "It felt like he didn't care about us," she said softly, "like we didn't matter." As each witness spoke, the picture grew clearer. David's actions weren't just negligent, they were fueled by prejudice. Laura emphasized this point during her closing remarks. "This isn't just about property damage," she told the jury. "It's about accountability, about recognizing when someone abuses their power and holding them responsible." Mr. Peterson tried his best to counter the prosecution's case. He argued that the damage to the car was unintentional and that David's comments were taken out of context. But his argument sounded weak compared to the overwhelming evidence presented by Laura. Even some of David's former colleagues testified against him, sharing examples of discriminatory behavior they'd witnessed over the years. One officer, a young woman named Emily, described a traffic stop where David had mocked a driver's accent before writing an unfair ticket. Another recalled a domestic dispute call where David dismissed a black woman's concerns, assuming she was lying. Each story added weight to the prosecution's case, painting a damning portrait of a man who let bias guide his decisions. Throughout it all, David remained silent, refusing to take the stand in his own defense. His lawyer advised him not to risk saying something damaging, but his silence only made him seem guilty. By the time closing arguments rolled around, the outcome seemed inevitable. When the jury returned with their verdict, the room held its breath. The foreman stood, clearing his throat before speaking. "We find the defendant, David Ryan, guilty on all counts." A murmur rippled through the crowd. David slumped in his chair, disbelief etched across his face. Guilty? How could this happen? He glanced at his lawyer, who shook his head slightly, signaling there was nothing more he could do. The judge wasted no time delivering the sentence. "David Ryan," she began, her voice firm, "you have been found guilty of malicious destruction of property motivated by hate. This court takes such offenses seriously. You are hereby sentenced to 3 years in prison without parole eligibility. Additionally, you will pay restitution for the damages caused and forfeit your badge permanently." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. 3 years might not sound like much, but for someone like David, who had never faced real consequences before, it felt like a lifetime. As bailiffs led him away in handcuffs, he kept his head down, avoiding the stares of those around him. Outside the courthouse, chaos erupted. Protesters cheered, holding signs that read, "Justice served," and "Accountability matters." Reporters rushed to interview Michael Carter, who gave a brief statement. "Today's verdict is a step toward fairness," he said. "But our work doesn't end here. We must continue striving for reform within law enforcement, so that incidents like this never happen again." Laura Monroe stood nearby, watching the scene unfold. She felt a mix of relief and determination. Relief that justice had been served, but determination to keep pushing for change. She knew one trial wouldn't fix everything, but it was a start. Back at the precinct, reactions were mixed. Some officers grumbled about the sentence, claiming it was too harsh. Others breathed sighs of relief, glad that someone had finally been held accountable. A few even admitted privately that David's behavior had gone unchecked for far too long. For Karen, David's wife, the verdict was devastating. She had hoped for leniency, believing her husband could redeem himself. Instead, she found herself facing public shame and financial strain. Friends stopped calling, neighbors avoided her, and bills piled up. Desperate for a fresh start, she filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. Their son, Jake, moved in with his grandparents, unable to forgive his father for tarnishing their family name. David's fall from grace sent shockwaves through the community. People debated whether the punishment fit the crime, but most agreed it was a wake-up call. The case sparked conversations about systemic racism and police reform, inspiring protests and policy proposals. Community leaders organized town halls, inviting citizens to share their experiences and ideas. For the first time in years, real progress seemed possible. Meanwhile, Laura continued her work, using David's case as a catalyst for broader changes. She collaborated with activists, lawmakers, and educators to develop training programs aimed at reducing bias among officers. Her efforts earned her praise and criticism, but she pressed on, undeterred. In prison, David struggled to adapt to his new reality. Used to commanding respect, he now faced hostility from inmates and guards alike. Fellow prisoners taunted him, calling him officer bigot and mocking his downfall. Guards treated him coldly, disgusted by his crimes. Isolated and humiliated, David began to reflect on his choices, not out of genuine remorse perhaps, but out of self-preservation. He attended mandatory counseling sessions, reluctantly engaging in discussions about prejudice and privilege. At first he resisted, dismissing the lessons as pointless, but slowly, cracks appeared in his hardened exterior. One session, led by a former inmate turned counselor, struck a chord. The counselor shared his own story of redemption, urging David to confront his biases if he ever wanted to move forward. David didn't respond openly, but something stirred inside him. Maybe it was regret, maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the realization that his old way of thinking had cost him everything. Whatever it was, it marked the beginning of a painful journey, one that would test his ability to change. As months passed, society began taking tentative steps toward healing. The scars of David's actions remained, but they also served as reminders of the need for accountability and growth. People started asking hard questions. How could they prevent similar incidents in the future? What role did they play in perpetuating inequality? And most importantly, how could they build a fairer, more just world? For now, though, the focus remained on moving forward. David's case had ignited a fire, a spark of hope that justice could prevail, even in the face of entrenched biases. Whether it would burn brightly enough to inspire lasting change remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: the road ahead would require courage, honesty, and unwavering commitment from everyone involved. David Ryan's first day in prison was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The cold gray walls of the facility closed in around him as he walked through the heavy metal doors. Gone were the days when he could command respect with a badge and a uniform. Now he was just another inmate, number 82734, stripped of his authority and forced to follow rules set by others. The other prisoners sized him up immediately. News of his arrival spread quickly, thanks to local media coverage of his trial. Officer Bigot, they called him, sneering whenever he passed by. David tried to keep his head down, but it was impossible to avoid their taunts. Some mocked him openly, imitating his voice or mimicking his actions from the security footage that had aired on television. Others took a more direct approach, shoving him in line or stealing his belongings during mealtimes. Even the guards treated him differently. Most of them disliked cops who broke the law, seeing them as hypocrites who betrayed the system they swore to uphold. They assigned David to the toughest jobs, cleaning toilets, scrubbing floors, and working long hours in the kitchen. If he complained, they ignored him. If he argued, they added extra chores to his list. At night, lying on a thin mattress in a cramped cell, David replayed the events leading up to this moment over and over in his mind. He thought about the teenagers he had confronted that evening, the damage he caused to Michael Carter's car, and the way his life unraveled so quickly after. For the first time, he allowed himself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he had made a mistake. But self-reflection was painful, and David often pushed those thoughts aside. Instead, he focused on survival. He learned to blend into the background, avoiding eye contact and keeping conversations short. When bullies targeted him, he swallowed his pride and handed over whatever they demanded. Fighting back would only make things worse. Back in the outside world, Karen Ryan struggled to rebuild her life without David. Their marriage had been strained for years, but the divorce proceedings felt like ripping off a bandage she wasn't ready to lose. She sold their house, a modest suburban home filled with memories, and moved into a small apartment downtown. It was quieter there, away from nosy neighbors who whispered behind her back. Financially, things were tough. Without David's income, Karen relied on her part-time job at a daycare center to pay the bills. She picked up extra shifts whenever she could, sometimes working late into the evening. Despite the exhaustion, she found solace in the children she cared for. Their laughter reminded her of happier times, before everything fell apart. Their teenage son Jake coped differently. He spent most of his time holed up in his room, headphones on, scrolling through social media. At school, classmates teased him relentlessly about his father's crimes. "Your dad's a racist," one boy sneered during lunch. Another posted screenshots of news articles mocking David, tagging Jake in cruel comments online. Jake hated, feeling like he carried his father's shame. He stopped talking to his friends, skipped family gatherings, and avoided answering calls from relatives. His grades slipped, and teachers grew concerned. When Karen suggested therapy, Jake refused. "I'm fine," he insisted, even though he clearly wasn't. Despite the challenges, Karen refused to give up. She enrolled in night classes at a community college, hoping to build a better future for herself and Jake. Studying gave her purpose, something to focus on besides the chaos surrounding them. Slowly, she began making new connections with classmates, professors, and co-workers who offered support and encouragement. Meanwhile, Laura Monroe continued her fight for systemic change within law enforcement. The verdict in David's case had sparked widespread discussions about bias and accountability, and Laura seized the opportunity to push for reforms. She partnered with community organizations, hosting workshops for officers on recognizing unconscious prejudices and improving interactions with minority groups. One initiative involved body cameras. Laura advocated for stricter policies requiring officers to wear them at all times, ensuring transparency during encounters with the public. She also pushed for independent oversight committees to review complaints against police, believing that external accountability could prevent abuses of power. Her efforts weren't always welcomed. Some officers resisted the changes, claiming they were unnecessary or intrusive. Others accused Laura of targeting them unfairly, using David's case as an excuse to impose new restrictions. But Laura remained steadfast, reminding herself why she started this work in the first place. "I'm not here to attack anyone," she told a group of skeptical officers during a training session. "I'm here because we can do better. Because every person deserves to feel safe and respected when interacting with law enforcement." Her words resonated with some. Younger officers, especially, appreciated her straightforward approach and willingness to listen. They saw her not as an enemy but as someone genuinely committed to improving the profession they loved. Michael Carter, too, played a key role in driving change. As FBI director, he used his platform to advocate for policies aimed at reducing racial profiling and increasing diversity within law enforcement agencies. He spoke at conferences, wrote opinion pieces, and met with lawmakers to push for legislation addressing systemic issues. His message was simple yet powerful. We cannot claim to serve justice while ignoring injustice within our own ranks. People listened, not just because of his position, but because of the integrity he demonstrated throughout the trial. Even critics admitted that Michael's calm demeanor and focus on solutions inspired hope for a brighter future. As months passed, the ripple effects of David's case became clearer. Cities across the country reviewed their policing practices, implementing reforms inspired by the lessons learned. Activists organized marches and rallies, demanding further action. Educators incorporated discussions about bias and privilege into school curriculums, teaching younger generations to think critically about fairness and equality. For David, however, life inside prison remained bleak. Though he managed to stay out of trouble, loneliness gnawed at him constantly. Letters from Karen arrived sporadically, each one shorter than the last. Jake never wrote. Visits were rare, and when they did happen, conversations felt stilted and awkward. One day, during a counseling session, David finally opened up. The counselor, a former inmate named Marcus Johnson, had earned a reputation for helping others confront their mistakes. He listened patiently as David talked about his anger, his regrets, and his fears for the future. "You've got two choices," Marcus said gently. "You can let this break you, or you can use it to grow. Either way, it's your decision." David didn't respond right away. He stared at the floor, considering the man's words. Growth sounded nice in theory, but what did it mean in practice? Could someone like him, someone who had spent decades thinking one way, really change? That night, lying awake in his bunk, David thought about his son. He imagined Jake sitting alone in his room, angry and hurt. For the first time, David wondered if maybe his actions had consequences beyond himself. Maybe the pain he caused extended farther than he realized. It was a sobering realization, one that left him restless and uneasy. But it was also the beginning of something. A tiny flicker of hope amidst the darkness. Whether it would grow into something meaningful remained to be seen. For now, David clung to it, desperate for any sense of redemption. Outside the prison walls, the world kept moving forward. People marched, protested, and debated. Laws changed, policies evolved, and communities came together to demand justice. And though scars remained from David's actions, they served as reminders of the importance of accountability, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole. Change wouldn't come overnight, but the seeds had been planted. All anyone could do now was nurture them, watering them with courage, honesty, and perseverance. One day, perhaps, they would bloom into something beautiful. 2 years passed since David Ryan first entered prison. To the outside world, it might have seemed like just another stretch of time, but for David, every day felt like an eternity. The gray walls of his cell had become a constant reminder of the life he had lost. Yet within those same walls, something unexpected began to take root: change. David's transformation didn't happen overnight. At first, it was small things. He started paying closer attention during counseling sessions, listening instead of shutting down. Marcus Johnson, the counselor who had spoken so frankly to him earlier, noticed the shift. "You're quieter now," Marcus said one afternoon after a session, "not because you're avoiding the conversation, but because you're actually thinking." David shrugged, unsure how to respond. He wasn't ready to admit that Marcus was right, but deep down he knew it was true. For the first time in his life, he was questioning the beliefs he had held onto for decades, the biases he had never even realized were there. One day, during a group therapy session, another inmate named Tony shared a story about growing up poor in a predominantly black neighborhood. He talked about being stopped by police multiple times as a teenager, always treated like a suspect despite doing nothing wrong. "It made me hate cops," Tony admitted. "Even though I've got my own problems now, I still remember what it felt like to be judged before anyone even knew me." David listened intently, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. He wanted to dismiss Tony's words as exaggeration or bitterness, but he couldn't. They mirrored the stories he'd heard during his trial, the testimonies of Marcus, Jasmine, and others who had been on the receiving end of his prejudice. Slowly, painfully, David began to see himself through their eyes. After the session, David approached Marcus privately. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the first time he had ever sought advice without being prompted. Marcus smiled faintly. "You keep going," he said. "Change isn't easy, especially when it's this deep. But if you're serious about turning things around, you'll find a way." David nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what turning things around meant. Was it possible to undo the harm he had caused? Could he ever earn forgiveness not just from others, but from himself? Outside the prison, Karen Ryan continued piecing her life back together. She graduated from community college with honors, earning a certificate in early childhood education. Her professors praised her dedication, and her classmates admired her resilience. Though she rarely spoke about David, she carried the weight of their past with quiet strength. Karen also worked hard to reconnect with Jake. Their relationship had been strained for years, long before David's arrest, but the scandal had pushed them further apart. Determined to bridge the gap, Karen invited Jake to dinner once a week. At first, he resisted, making excuses or showing up late. But slowly, they began talking again, tentatively at first, then more openly. One evening, over spaghetti and garlic bread, Jake finally brought up his father. "Do you think he regrets what he did?" he asked, staring at his plate. Karen hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I don't know," she said. "But I hope so. Regret is part of learning, isn't it?" Jake frowned, unconvinced. "Even if he does regret it, it doesn't fix what happened. People still look at me like I'm guilty too." Karen reached across the table, placing a hand on his arm. "You're not responsible for your dad's actions, Jake. None of us are. All we can do is focus on our own choices and make sure we're better than the mistakes he made." Jake didn't answer, but later that night he hugged his mom tightly before leaving. It was the closest they had come to reconciliation in months, and Karen held on to the moment like a lifeline. Meanwhile, Laura Monroe's efforts to reform law enforcement gained momentum. Her advocacy inspired new policies nationwide, including mandatory bias training for officers and stricter oversight measures. Cities implemented pilot programs pairing social workers with police during nonviolent calls, aiming to reduce unnecessary arrests and improve community relations. Laura traveled frequently, speaking at conferences and meeting with officials eager to learn from her experiences. Despite the progress, she remained grounded, aware that systemic change required patience and persistence. "We're planting seeds," she told a reporter during an interview. "Some will grow quickly, others will take longer. But every step forward matters." Michael Carter, too, kept pushing for justice. As FBI director, he oversaw investigations into misconduct within law enforcement agencies, ensuring accountability at the highest levels. His leadership earned him respect not only in Washington but also among grassroots activists fighting for equality. Together, Laura and Michael became symbols of hope, a reminder that individuals could drive meaningful change, even against overwhelming odds. Their collaboration extended beyond policy reforms, inspiring younger generations to pursue careers in public service with integrity and purpose. Back in prison, David continued grappling with his past. He wrote letters to Karen and Jake, though he never sent them. Pouring his thoughts onto paper helped him process his emotions even if they weren't ready to hear what he had to say. In one letter to Jake, he wrote, "I know I messed up. I know I hurt people, including you. I wish I could go back and change everything, but I can't. All I can do is promise to try harder, to be someone worth respecting. I hope someday you'll believe me." Though David doubted Jake would forgive him, writing the words gave him a sense of clarity. For the first time, he understood that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about accepting responsibility and striving to do better moving forward. As his release date approached, David grew anxious. Life outside prison would be challenging, filled with judgment and rejection. He worried about finding work, rebuilding relationships, and facing the consequences of his actions daily. But he also felt a flicker of determination, a desire to prove that he wasn't the same man who had walked into prison years ago. On the morning of his release, David stood in line with other inmates waiting to exit the facility. Guards handed him civilian clothes, a plain white shirt, jeans, and sneakers, and processed his paperwork silently. When the heavy metal doors swung open, David stepped outside, blinking in the bright sunlight. The world looked different somehow. Cars sped past on nearby roads and birds chirped overhead. Everything seemed louder, brighter, and more alive than he remembered. For a moment, David simply stood there, breathing deeply, letting the fresh air fill his lungs. A bus waited nearby to take released inmates to a halfway house. David climbed aboard, taking a seat near the window. As the bus pulled away, he glanced back at the prison receding in the distance. It wasn't home, but it had shaped him in ways he couldn't ignore. At the halfway house, David met others struggling to rebuild their lives. Some were former addicts, others ex-cons like him. They shared meals together, attended job fairs, and participated in group discussions about reintegration. For the first time in years, David felt like part of a community, not defined by his mistakes, but united by a shared goal of moving forward. One evening, while scrolling through job listings online, David came across an ad for a janitorial position at a local school. The pay was low and the hours were long, but something about it resonated with him. Maybe it was the idea of contributing to a place where children learned and grew. Or maybe it was the chance to start over, away from the shadow of his old career. He applied immediately, attaching a handwritten note explaining his background and expressing his willingness to work hard. To his surprise, the school called him for an interview. Sitting across from the principal, David spoke honestly about his past, acknowledging his failures while emphasizing his desire to make amends. "We all deserve second chances," the principal said after a long pause. "Let's see how this goes." When David received the offer letter, he cried, not out of joy but relief. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. A chance to show the world and himself that he could be more than the sum of his mistakes. Life outside prison wouldn't be easy, and David knew that. But as he tucked the letter into his pocket, he felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile yet undeniable belief that redemption was possible, even for someone like him. David Ryan's new life began quietly. He rented a small, run-down apartment in a town far from the city where he had once worked as a police officer. The place was nothing fancy, a one-bedroom unit with peeling wallpaper and creaky floors, but it gave him privacy and distance from his past. Every morning, he woke up early, brewed a cup of instant coffee, and caught the bus to the school where he now worked as a janitor. The job wasn't glamorous. He spent his days cleaning classrooms, mopping hallways, and emptying trash cans. But David didn't mind. There was something humbling about starting over, about earning respect through hard work rather than authority. The teachers and students barely noticed him at first, which suited him fine. He preferred staying in the background, keeping his head down, and focusing on the tasks at hand. Over time, though, people began to warm up to him. A kind-hearted teacher named Mrs. Alvarez often left snacks for him in the break room. "You've got a tough job," she said with a smile one afternoon. "Thought you could use these." David nodded awkwardly, unsure how to respond. "Thanks," he muttered, stuffing the cookies into his backpack. It was such a simple gesture, but it meant more to him than he cared to admit. Even the kids started treating him differently. At first, they whispered behind his back or giggled when he walked by, but after weeks of seeing him every day, quietly sweeping floors, fixing broken chairs, and tidying up their messes, they grew curious. One boy, a shy fifth grader named Ethan, approached him during lunch one day. "Are you really a convict?" Ethan asked bluntly, his eyes wide with curiosity. David froze, gripping the mop handle tightly. For a moment he considered brushing off the question or walking away, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the innocence in Ethan's voice or the realization that hiding wouldn't change anything. "Yes," David admitted finally. "I used to be a cop, but I made some bad choices. Now I'm here, trying to do better." Ethan tilted, his head thinking it over. "Okay," he said simply before running off to join his friends. That brief exchange became a turning point for David. Slowly, the children began talking to him more freely, asking questions about his work or sharing stories about their own lives. Some even thanked him when he fixed a broken desk or cleaned up spilled juice. Those small moments of connection reminded David why he had chosen this path: to rebuild trust, one person at a time. Outside of work, David tried reconnecting with his family. He wrote letters to Karen and Jake, updating them on his progress and apologizing again for everything he had done. His words were careful, sincere, and free of excuses. He didn't expect forgiveness, not yet, but he hoped they would see how much he had changed. Karen responded first. Her letter was short but thoughtful. She told him about her new job teaching preschool and mentioned that Jake was doing better in school. "I'm glad you're working hard," she wrote, "but healing takes time for all of us." Jake didn't reply right away. When he finally did, months later, his message was terse. "I don't know if I can forgive you, but I'll try." Those few sentences brought tears to David's eyes. They weren't perfect, but they were a start. As the years passed, David settled into his routine. He saved money, took night classes at a community college, and volunteered at local shelters during weekends. Each step forward felt like proof that he was capable of growth, no matter how slow or difficult it might be. People noticed his efforts. Neighbors greeted him warmly, co-workers trusted him with responsibilities, and strangers occasionally complimented his dedication. Meanwhile, Laura Monroe continued advocating for justice and reform. Her work inspired countless others, including young officers determined to serve with integrity. She published articles, gave speeches, and mentored aspiring leaders within law enforcement. Though she rarely spoke publicly about David's case anymore, its impact lingered in every policy change and training program she helped implement. Michael Carter retired from the FBI, leaving behind a legacy of fairness and accountability. He remained active in the fight for equality, speaking at conferences and supporting grassroots organizations. Together, Michael and Laura became symbols of hope, a reminder that individuals could drive meaningful change, even in the face of systemic challenges. Back in the town where David lived, life moved forward too. The scars of his actions still lingered, but they also served as reminders of the importance of accountability. Community members organized events promoting dialogue and understanding, encouraging residents to confront biases and embrace diversity. Schools introduced programs focused on empathy and inclusion, teaching children to value differences rather than fear them. For David, the road to redemption was long and uncertain. He knew he couldn't undo the harm he had caused, but he could dedicate himself to making amends. On weekends, he visited local youth groups, sharing his story and urging teenagers to think critically about prejudice and privilege. Some listened intently, others dismissed him as a hypocrite. Either way, David kept showing up, believing that even small seeds of change mattered. One evening, nearly 5 years after his release from prison, David received an unexpected visitor. It was Jake, standing nervously on the doorstep of his apartment. David invited him inside, offering tea and snacks while they sat in awkward silence. "I wasn't sure if I'd come," Jake admitted finally. "Mom said it was okay, but I wasn't ready until now." David nodded, giving him space to speak. "I understand," he said softly. "You don't have to forgive me. I just want you to know I'm sorry for everything." Jake looked at him, searching his face for answers. "Do you mean it? Or are you just saying that because you think it's what I want to hear?" David hesitated, then shook his head. "I mean it. I can't take back what I did, but I can spend the rest of my life proving I've changed. I owe that to you, to Mom, and to everyone else I hurt." They talked for hours that night, covering topics they had avoided for years. Jake shared his struggles growing up under the shadow of David's mistakes, while David listened without interrupting. By the end of the visit, neither of them had fully healed, but they both felt lighter, as if a weight they hadn't realized they were carrying had begun to lift. Months later, Jake introduced David to his girlfriend, a bright and compassionate young woman named Lily. She accepted him cautiously at first, aware of his past but willing to give him a chance. Over dinner one night, she asked him about his journey toward redemption. David spoke honestly, acknowledging his failures while emphasizing his commitment to doing better. "It's not easy," he admitted. "Some days I wonder if I'll ever truly make up for what I did. But I keep going because giving up isn't an option." Lily smiled, nodding. "That's brave," she said. "Not everyone would admit their mistakes, let alone try to fix them." By the time Jake graduated from high school, David had earned enough trust to attend the ceremony. Sitting in the audience, watching his son walk across the stage, David felt a surge of pride and gratitude. He knew he didn't deserve this moment, but he cherished it all the same. Years turned into decades. David grew older, his hair streaked with gray, and his hands calloused from years of labor. Yet he remained steadfast in his mission to contribute positively to the world. He never sought recognition or praise. Instead, he found fulfillment in knowing that he had played a part in creating a fairer, kinder society. In the end, David's story became a testament to the power of accountability and growth. It reminded people that no one is beyond redemption if they're willing to face their flaws and strive for change. And though the scars of his actions would always remain, they also served as a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in darkness, light could emerge. As David looked back on his life, he realized that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it, growing stronger, and using those lessons to build a better future for himself, for his family, and for the world around him.